really great for us to have opportunities to learn. And that's why we call this meeting today a lunch and learn, so that it's not, we could just get together and have lunch and socialize. And but I always think it's nice if we could have an opportunity to stretch a little bit and explore some new areas. So I've invited our presenter today, Dr. Inger Swimpson, and a little bit of background. I was fortunate last year to participate in a racial equity for nonprofit CEOs. I think that was the name of it, training that the Children's Services Council and the United Way offered. And as part of the training, I was very lucky to have some individual coaching. And my my coach was Dr. Inger Swimpson. And I hope it's okay if I refer to you as Inger going forward. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So we've been working together since last year, and actually after the coaching time ran out through that initiative, we as an organization reached out to Inger to ask her if she would continue working with me. And so Inger and I meet monthly to talk about all kinds of issues related to equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And specifically as it relates to our organization, but life. We have great chats about food, and we have a lot of things in common. So we have a lot of great chats about life and all kinds of experiences like that. So you in the invitation for today, there was a little bit of a bio about Inger. And as you may have gathered, she's a distinguished educator. She's been involved in the Montgomery County School.
Yep, Montgomery County Public Schools in Rockville, Maryland.
There we go. For a very long time. I won't tell you how many years.
Long enough to retire.
Okay, there you go. And very importantly, she also is the founder of an organization called BOND, which is stands for Building Our Network of Diversity, and it's for male educators of color, for them to, and you're going to correct me if I don't get it quite right, but it's for them to convene and get together to talk about the challenges that male educators of color have. Number one, there are not too many of them, and the expectations and the burdens that they perhaps face in their jobs of educating our kids. And I know Inger was telling me that they just had a very successful conference this past weekend. And Inger, I don't know if you're going to want to share any of that, but at this point, I want to welcome Inger Swimpson and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joel. And it is so nice to be able to hear and see the folks at the Executive Service Corps, because even in our conversations about food and weather and basketball and life, as Joel mentioned, we talk about work. We talk about the different dynamics that come with a career. So I want to start with just kind of an introduction to what we're going to be focusing on today. So if I could share, or
oh yeah, let me set you up to share. Give me one moment.
And I love the idea of the lunch and learn. Even though it's virtual, you still have lunch. That's awesome.
Let's see. Okay, Inger, I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So we're going to be talking about the other 98 and how it emphasizes or how it speaks to implicit bias at work. So just to give you a little background on what this is all about, I did some quick research on implicit bias, because that's part of what I do. I do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, social justice. And as I was looking for a title that would hopefully kind of ignite people's curiosity and attention, I came across this quote, this data point about emotional cognition, and you'll see this in the slide, that only 2% of our emotional cognition is conscious. The other, or the remainder, which is the other 98, lives in these unconscious networks where implicit, racial, and other biases live. And so we're going to interrogate that a little bit by exploring, who we are, how does this impact what we do, how do we define implicit bias, and how does it make some connections to the work at Executive Service Corps. So before we get into that, just a little bit more about me. As Joel mentioned, I am an educator. I was in education formerly, I should say, K-12 education for 30 years, K-12 and higher ed. But my passion has always been around teaching. I enjoy teaching. I'm going to tell you, if you ever decide to go into it, it's a great profession, but grading papers, I did not enjoy that part. So I enjoyed, though, really elevating the curiosity around minds. I enjoyed the relationship building that's so important to really help kids understand the value of education. If they don't know how much you care about them, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And being able to do that and being able to see how much it influences and impacts the lives of students was awesome. But I also served in other capacities in the administrative world of education as a director and human resources and partnerships. So a lot of different areas there. But before I even did any of that, I grew up in North Carolina, small town in North Carolina, Elizabeth City. And you see the flag down there at the bottom. It's on the coast, so that's why I appreciate where you all are. I love the sunshine. I love the beach. I grew up 40 miles from the Outer Banks and about 45 miles from Virginia Beach. So at any time I could get to water. Here in Silver Spring, we can get to it, but it takes us a few hours. So, but I still always call North Carolina home, even though I live here in Maryland. And then my academic career, higher education, started at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, or North Carolina A&T. It is a historically Black college, one of the largest. As a matter of fact, it is the largest HBCU in the country now. So we are very proud of that, very proud of the graduates, the programs, most importantly, the relationships that develop from that. And so that being said, I am a very relational person. I believe that relationships are the foundation for how people develop trust and how they connect. And so I have a very strong relationship with two of my heartbeats, Coleman, who is my oldest son. He is 15, and his name means lively peacemaker. And we were intentional about naming him, giving him a name that had meaning and that also spoke to his personality and who we hoped he would be. And then I have a 5-year-old. His name is Blake. And Blake, when I did a little research on that, is someone who likes to help others and a natural leader. And so I believe in speaking things as you wish them to be. And this is what we hope for our boys. Now, as I mentioned, the 2%, only 2% of our emotional cognition is what we actually think about, what we actually intentionally think about. And the rest of that lives in our unconscious. So we don't even know it's happening. It's in the background. It's like that background music that you are paying attention to, but not really paying attention to. And it's where our different types of bias reside. So it could be implicit, it could be racial, it could be age bias, because there are a lot of different biases that we hold. And as we're thinking today, as we're connecting today, as we're talking today, I want us to engage in conversation. And really, it is truly not just the learning, but it's the dialogue that goes with that learning. I try to create the space so that we can talk, so that we can learn from each other and share experiences. So we're going to focus on what implicit bias is, how we are hardwired. You can't get away from implicit bias. There's some ways to interrupt and to minimize it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But our brain is hardwired for this. And then, how is all of this connecting? How does our lunch and learn topic of implicit bias, how does that connect to the work of Executive Service Corps? All right. Agreements. It's always good to have some community agreements, and these are just ways for us to connect. So when your mind might start to judge, I invite you to instead turn that to wonder. Okay. And then it's a good way for us to approach problems and approach challenges by thinking about it from a space of curiosity. And we have lots of different perspectives, and they're all welcome. So we invite you to speak your truth and let other people speak theirs, because lived experiences are important and they're different depending upon the person. Be present, engage in active listening, and be aware of your thoughts and feelings in the moment. If there's something that happens and feels kind of prickly, kind of interrogate, what is it that's said or done that makes you feel that way? And this is not just for this conversation, but really any kind of conversation, because again, we're trying to unpack some of those things, some of those implicit biases that kind of go on in our heads in the background. No one knows everything. No one knows everything. Trust me, I do not know everything about implicit bias, but together we know a lot. Together we know a lot because we've got different experiences, and shared learning is really a practice in humility, because we all have something to learn from everyone who is in this space. And it also gives us a responsibility to share out what we already know so that we can learn and grow together. Lean in and lean out, think about and kind of explore the room and think about, when do you need to lean in? And if you're the kind of person who leans in often, consider, how do I lean out and allow other voices in the space? And if you're the type of person who tends to lean out, then we invite you to lean into the conversation as well. Listen to understand. There may be some points here that you want to challenge. And again, I invite you to be open to understanding some of the data, understanding some of the experiences that we're going to talk about. And as much as we like to be, we are human, and therefore we are imperfect. So we can't be articulate all the time, but people can sometimes feel a little hesitant about chiming in, leaning in, if they are feeling that I may not say this the right way. It's okay. We're inviting you to say things as you need to. All right. So those are some community agreements. I'm just going to ask, anybody need clarification on any of those, or is there anything that you're kind of feeling like, I don't know if I can support that? If so, I want you to say that. Okay, because we're building space to have, we're building brave space. We're building brave space to have some conversations. All right. So I said my background is education. I'm always a teacher. So one of the things that we always do as educators is we ignite learning. We ignite that thinking. So we do that by activating the brain. And we're activating the brain today by focusing on implicit bias. So I want you to do this for me, please. I'd like for you to write down 3 words that come to mind quickly when you first think about implicit bias. You can just write them down. If you want, you can put them in the chat. And then 2 questions that you have about implicit bias. And we're going to talk about one experience you've had or observation you've made of implicit bias. So a 3, 2, 1, 3 words that come to mind when first thinking about it. And don't spend a lot of time trying to think about it. Just what comes to mind immediately when you hear the term implicit bias. Drop that in the chat or write it down somewhere that you can refer back to it. And then 2 questions that come to mind, curiosities, queries about implicit bias. And then hold in your head an experience that you've had or an observation that you have made about implicit bias. Okay. Love it. Words, intentional, open, empathy. Okay, great. Judgment, confusion, misconceptions. Thank you, Madeline. Hiring, politics, bias. Alexa, I appreciate that. Bindu, thank you for that. Colorblindness, privilege, inequality. Let's see, Joel, book cover, assumption, ageism. Great. All right. Closed judgment, reactionary. Thank you, Tom. All right, I'll give you some time now to get those questions down. All right, thank you, Kathy. Widespread hidden trend. How do we best become aware? Okay, we're going to explore some of these, so thank you. How do you call it out? How can we turn it around? What can be done to mitigate our own implicit bias? Thank you. Thank you, Janelle. We are definitely going to be exploring some of these questions. And we're not going to have an opportunity to go really deep into them. So you're always invited to do more learning on your own, but we will touch on a lot of the questions that you all have shared here. And again, with that one experience, just hold that in your head. You can jot it down if you need to, but you don't have to put that one in the chat. All right. So now that we've formulated some ideas around implicit bias, I'm going to share with you, give you a shared definition of implicit bias. So I need somebody to come off mic and read the definition for me.
I will. I've got a radio voice. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. Implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes and generalizations that impact our understanding, our actions, and our decisions about an individual or group.
All right. So now I'm going to ask you to take a look back at the words, the 3 words that came to mind. And how do those words that you wrote down connect to the definition? Do you see some of your words in this definition of implicit bias?
How do can you hear me, Dr. Swimpson?
Yes.
Okay.
English good.
The one piece was the cultural differences and how I had to really navigate a jungle when I first arrived in this country. I didn't want to come across as something else, but at the same time, it was challenging.
Hmm. When you say you didn't want to come across as something else, talk more about that.
The assumptions the average American has about India when I came here, which was in the 70s, was it was the land of snake charmers and camel rides and all this kind of crazy stuff. Whereas I led a charmed life in India. And I didn't want to come across as being, the lack of a better phrase, and it's been overused, privileged. But I knew that this was where I was going to stay. It was tricky. I was crossing the divide, wanted to be accepted. There was a lot of shallow interaction that took place initially. How my struggle was to sift through all that to really make a true connection. It was about finding connections.
It's about finding connections. And oftentimes those connections aren't surfaced because we don't take the time to develop the relationships and have the conversations. Just as you said, it was tricky navigating. It was tricky navigating, again, because there's so many perceptions and assumptions, and those are all things that are part of implicit bias that we carry with us throughout our lives. And those assumptions and perceptions, they define people. They define people, at least initially. That's what we use to make some determinations. So thank you. Thank you so much for that, Bindu. Anyone else?
Yeah, but this is Patrick. I think there is a big difference also in terms of the how we live it. The workplace is very different to life, normal life. For one reason, workplace, there is always the notion of hierarchy. And that is making that the bias even different. I lead. I am very fortunate because I have been in a company where diversity and inclusion was practiced since 25 years ago. And I lead the European Committee for 5 years for inclusion and diversity. So that's what I'm saying. In workplace, it's very different to real life, normal life on the street.
Is it different for everyone or is it different for some?
For most is different. And I really agree also with what Bindu said. The culture has a huge impact also on what is the implicit bias. I'm not American. I'm from Europe. And moving to US, I can see a difference in terms of behavior. There are some common behavior, but there are also some very different behavior.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have to be aware of is how those behaviors have to shift and adapt as the workplace becomes more inclusive, as the workplace becomes more diverse. Because oftentimes the things that we consider as part of a normal workplace culturally may not be normal for everyone. And so understanding that and understanding that part of those things that we consider as normal, they lie in implicit bias. They lie and are rooted in implicit bias.
Yes, but in the workplace, there is a governance, there are policies. And if you agree or not, you say you have to agree on what is the policy. If you disagree, then you quit the company, the workplace. In the normal life, it's different. The policies are more a common sense, and that common sense are very different based on people.
We're going to interrogate that some, because I heard you say that one of the things, if you don't like the policies, that you quit. But who defines the policies?
Oh, that's the top management define the policy.
And who's typically at top management?
Oh, there are things. They are the CEO and the board. The board is
Mhm.
very important to define the policy.
Right.
Old white
And,
men, I
and
think.
so when we
But
think
first-
about that, we have to think about who makes up the board, who makes up the CEO. What does that look like? Does the board, does the CEO look like and reflect the world? What
No.
we see? Oftentimes
Um,
not. Oftentimes not.
I agree, but that's why we need the board. There is a committee also helping the board to define how to do it and how to help the company. I'm talking about the workplace mainly.
Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of what happens outside of the workplace becomes a microcosm of the world. So let's talk about that
Yeah,
more.
yeah.
Let's interrogate that more. But I really appreciate your questions, Patrick. So let's also explore. Are there any other words that you wrote down that connect to the definition? Anyone else have some that they want to share? All right. Oh,
Yeah.
Yep.
I'll share quickly. One of the things I wrote down as one of my words was ageism.
mhm,
And I think maybe a few people here can relate to this, but I know I experienced when I sold my business and decided I wanted to re-enter the workforce as an older worker. There were a lot, I experienced a lot of bias in terms of the people who were making the hiring decisions. And it really impacted the way I felt I had to dress and look. Because
mhm,
I didn't want people who were in a position to hire me to think that I was over the hill. Especially one of them, I know for a fact that people, when they look at an older worker, they look at all this experience and they're overqualified, or
mm,
they have
mhm.
a bias saying, oh well, they're not going to have the energy to be able to keep up with the pace. Or I mean, I can go on and on and on, but it really caused me to, because I remember many years ago doing a training. It was something that was kind of like an S-type training. And I remember the presenters, and it was done on a weekend, and the presenters always wore suits, both the men and women. And I remember going up to the presenter afterwards and asking, so what's the deal with the suit? And the person said to me, well, if I were wearing a t-shirt and jeans and presenting the same information, would you have certain things to get over in terms of who I am and my ability to impart this information? Just because he didn't use the word bias, but as opposed to wearing a suit. And that was
Mhm.
that always stuck with me, which is okay. Well, I'm going to assume that you're going to judge me based on what you see, and if it's important to me, in which case, looking for a job that was meaningful at this stage of my life was important to me. I'm just going to take that out of the equation. I don't want you to be thinking about whether I'm up to the task because of my age and my
Yeah.
experience.
Age and
I'd like to add to that, Joel.
mhm,
Having worked in corporate America and having worked as a consultant and having been a mother, the whole 9 yards, right? So when I first arrived from India and I found a position at a kind of a high-level ad agency in Georgetown, I mentally decided I was going to wear a sari to work every day. And within a few months, for my own sake, to connect with people at a level where I wanted them to really connect, it was important for me to, for the lack of a better phrase, look a little more like them.
mhm.
And so it was a huge cultural kind of a torture for me to give up this fabulous garment that I was wedded to for years and moved to wearing Western clothes. That's what I call them. And then I took time out to be a mother and came back to the workforce in 1990. And none of those things mattered to me that much anymore. I'd lived in this country so many years. And so it was easy to transition to being somebody that looked like somebody else down the street. So to your point, Joel, I totally agree with you. And if you look at what's happened in the corporate world, it started out with Blue Jean Fridays, and now it's Blue Jean every day. And I think we are all moving in that direction. I want other people to react to this. Any other comments? I'm sorry, Dr. Inger, I'm just kind of sharing what I.
Now I appreciate it. This is how this conversation goes. It's a lunch and learn. So it's me facilitating the conversation, but everybody's got to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bindu, to speak a little bit to your past experiences, I also had my own experiences with assimilation. When I moved to America, I was 10 years old. And so that's the age where you're impressionable and you want to fit in. And I know that you mentioned that it became normal for you to assimilate, but there's also a negative side to it. I remember coming to the conclusion that I needed to lose my accent very quickly because I wanted to be understood. I wanted to fit in. And I really pushed to the side my culture in order to be able to create networks and to just fit in as a young child. And it took years for me to rediscover myself and to then be able to fully appreciate the person that I am and my individuality. It wasn't until I was in college that I started to explore that a little bit more. And even now I grieve the loss of my accent. It only comes out when I'm mad at my children. But I definitely can relate to some of the changes that immigrants go through and when they do transition to a life in America to make their walk and their path that much easier. Because it can be difficult to be the other. And that was one of the words that I had written down when I was thinking about implicit bias was othering. That's something that I think is definitely unconscious in so many groups. I do it myself. And I think that we have to be just a little bit more conscious of how we as, well, not we anymore, but the dominant group and the majority kind of suppress minorities in certain aspects.
Yeah, and oftentimes that becomes a struggle. As a former teacher in a county that was extremely racially, culturally, and ethnically diverse, that was a struggle for a lot of my students. And many of them, just as you said, Janelle, they tried very hard to find a friend group that would accept them changing into that friend group, becoming more like them, minimizing who they were culturally in order to adapt and assimilate to a culture. And the struggle, I remember this clearly, the struggle was that so many parents who had those lived experiences did not want their kids to do that. They didn't want them to lose that. I wonder if your parents may have said, you have everything that we have poured into you. We don't want you to lose your culture. And we don't want you to lose your accent. But the pressure around kids, students, and adults can be so overwhelming. As you said, Bindu, you give up a part of who you are in order to fit in. And even though some people may have looked at that and said, well, it's just your clothes. It's not just your clothes. It's not just attire. It's not just what I'm wearing. It's who I am and who I represent, that you have to determine whether or not you're going to give that up and how much of it you're going to give up. So good. So let's talk about this really quickly. Looking back at the questions that you wrote, does the definition answer either of the questions that you wrote down? Does our definition of implicit bias, does that kind of help answer some of your questions? And it's okay if it doesn't, because we're still going to explore and interrogate more information around implicit bias. But are your questions answered there?
Hi, I would say my question was really, how do we, because you're well-intentioned, but it is your implicit bias. So how do you catch yourself while you're busy and in the heat of the moment to step back and check in if you're just going on an implicit bias, or if you should consciously think about things differently? How do you incorporate that into your life was really my question.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that too, Laura. We're going to touch on some of those things. But first, one of the things we have to really consider is, how does all of this implicit bias happen? Because it's not just me saying, okay, I'm going to be biased about something. It's the way our brain is conditioned, is wired for us to think, because part of it is a way for us to incorporate some lived experiences, incorporate what we know about certain situations. So we're going to touch on that. So thank you. Now, based on what you saw, is the definition, how is the definition of implicit bias similar or different from what you saw in just the words that were there? Some of you, I know, hit on some of those words that were included in the definition. And then there were some that were very different. And that's okay, because one of the things that I want to do now is give you an opportunity to kind of experience implicit bias and how it impacts your brain. So here's what we're going to do. On the next slide that you'll see, I am going to ask you to very simply unmute, and I want you to state or say aloud the font color of the text as it appears. You're just going to say on the next slide that's coming up, the font color as it appears. Okay? So you're going to need to unmute so that we can all say this in unison. Doesn't have to actually be in unison, but you're going to say it aloud. All right? All right, here we go.
Purple,
Blue,
red,
black, green, red,
Green, red,
blue,
black, black,
Blue,
green,
green,
black,
red, black, blue.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm
How
going to
come no
show.
one said purple? Sorry.
Now I'm going to show you another slide. And again, I want you to state the font color of the text as it appears. Okay.
blue,
red,
Green,
Black,
violet,
green,
red,
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 green,
black,
red,
blue,
blue,
black,
black,
green,
green, green,
red,
red, blue.
blue.
black.
All right. How many of you found yourselves struggling with the second slide to actually state the font color versus the word?
Excuse me. I did.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In listening, I'm glad it's recorded, because if I played it back, most of you would probably find that you were reading or you were stating not the font color, but the word. And that's because that's how our brains are wired. They're wired for us to do things a certain way. Even though you see the color, you had the directions, you tried it the first time. So that signals to me that you understood what you were supposed to do, but your brain said, that's not what we're supposed to do, because it's wired for me not to state a font color when I see a different word. The two are supposed to go together. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us in terms of implicit bias? It's something called the Stroop effect. The Stroop effect is essentially the way in which our brains are wired to do a certain thing, But once we introduce something that's slightly different, we go back to what we know. We go back to what we're familiar with. We go back to what seems comfortable and normal and what we have past experiences with. So imagine how the Stroop effect impacts not only the way that you are able to cite different colors, but it impacts everything that we do. So neuropsychologists tell us that it is built into the structure of our brain's neurons. This is just a quick science lesson about it. So our unconscious bias starts to process and it sifts through all of this information. And it's looking for patterns. It's looking for patterns at about 200,000 times more information than we can actually sort of sift through than the conscious mind. So when the unconscious brain starts to see two things occurring together, it begins to expect them to be seen together, and it begins to wire them together. And that brain imaging that you saw, it scans for different demonstrations of that one. So when people are shown images of faces that are different from themselves, it activates prejudgment, just as you all did. You were activating prejudgment just on colors and words. And your brain is starting to scan. And this is oftentimes demonstrated when people are shown images of faces that are different from them. And when they're shown these faces that are different, that's when that irrational prejudgment happens, because it's the brain's alert system for danger. And that happens in a certain part of your brain called the amygdala. And it's telling your brain, this is different, you need to be aware. So it happens very quickly. It happens extremely fast, in less than 1/10 of a second. And our associations and biases are activated every time the brain has encounters a group member, even consciously, and they think that we are in the process of developing some type of stereotype. So this happens, again, without us really knowing it. We have to be very, very intentional. I heard some voices who were able to correctly identify the font color, but what was very different was the speed and the pace from the first slide to the second slide. First slide, you were able to do it very quickly. Second slide, you had to slow your brain down in order to be very intentional. And that's what we oftentimes have to do when we're thinking about bias. So I want to share just another quick data point with you. So in the graph that you see here, the red line represents the biases that people will admit to, confidently admit to, and confidentially kind of admit to. All right, that's the red line. Almost no one will admit to having a prejudice against people who have disabilities or women, okay? But when unconscious biases are measured, that's the blue line, nearly 40% of the people have unconscious biases against people, against gender and race, Black people in particular. So what does that say? What does that tell us about the way that we are automatically wired to think about certain genders and think about certain races? So in order for us to not automatically go to some of those assumptions, we got to slow the brain down. We have to slow our thinking down. And when we slow our thinking down, it goes into these two different systems. Two systems of thinking that we all have. One is fast and intuitive, and that's what we consider system one thinking. And one is slow and deliberate. So system one happens very quickly. It's where 95% of our decisions are made. It's what we lean into with intuition and instinct. And then system two, that's where only a small percentage, only 5% of our decisions are made when we're using rational thinking. I'm gonna let that breathe
Yeah.
for just a minute. Only 5% of our decisions are made when we're using rational thinking. Everything else is done based on intuition, instinct, and experiences that we've had. And it happens quickly. Whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not, we don't take the time to really explore and interrogate. All right?
May I ask you a comment?
Sure.
Can you go back to the graph, please?
Uh-huh.
So I'm looking at this graph. So
Mhm.
when you have a survey, I'm talking about in US mainly, or you have to declare something about you. What do we ask in US? The color and gender.
Mhm.
Okay, most of the time, nobody's asking you if you're disabled. Nobody's asking you about your LGBT or you are legal immigrant or not. So this reflects also how the society is asked to identify themselves.
Mhm. I agree 100%, Patrick. And here's something that, from my position as an educator, that is a sticking point for me. When we measure certain ways in which students are achieving, we categorize them based upon whether they are based upon their socioeconomic status, which we consider as farms, that's free and reduced meals. So we look at socioeconomics. And we measure just that. We isolate that as a way to determine student success. So we say, all right, 95% of our students who are receiving farms are reading at a level of proficiency.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we might also say students who have students with disabilities. We measure that. We look at that and say, okay, students with disabilities, they're here. Then we also measure and look at students who are English language learners, or they've changed it now to emergent multilingual learners. So we take these specific categories and begin to make some judgments about students. Now, does it matter whether or not they are receiving free and reduced meals? Does it matter? Not really. Not to their learning, but it creates this bias. It creates a bias where people begin to look at those kids differently.
I have a
And that's
question.
the thing
Sorry.
we have to really be careful about, because those kids become adults. And then we begin looking at them differently as well. Yeah, Bindu.
So I'm going to speak specifically about race.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot begin to tell you how many forms I have had filled out in the United States where they ask you a question about race. And the one that comes closest to India is Asian, what's it, Pacific Islander? And I'm like, what the heck is that? But if I don't check, I cannot complete the form. So what are the new trends in forms that, or has that section been banned completely?
No, they still, again, my experience in the school system is that those forms are still used, and people can opt not to say what their race is. There's also the addition of multiracial, and they can also indicate other. So that's one of the ways that it's being addressed now. So yeah. All right. Now we've talked a little bit about how our brain is wired for this bias, that when we think and we're making decisions, those decisions are generally made most of the time using very quick, irrational thinking versus slowed down rational thinking. Now, I want you to go back and think about incident, an experience. This was one of the things. So I'd like for you to share any experience that you've had or observation you've made around implicit bias. And I've heard a couple of them already.
I'll go.
Okay.
I'm sorry for being the eager beaver. So when I was new in the US, people would approach, I mean, if I have a question or whatever, they would shout at me and speak slowly. The assumption, I think there, or the implicit bias there, was that by shouting and speaking slowly, they were making themselves clearly heard in a language that was alien to me. And by that decibel, that high decibel, I would be forced to hear. I'll throw it open to the group.
Anyone else have a similar experience or observed, even if you've not had it, you may have observed something similar?
I'll go. I had an experience. I was on the operating committee of the board of a big company, and it was time to select a new secretary of the operating committee. And the other members, who were men, white men, they said, "Oh, what woman can we get to do this position?" And I took that as an example of implicit bias. And I just did a Kathy, and I called them out and I said, "Why does it have to be a woman?" And they shut me down so fast, and I was so embarrassed. Because we recognize that women are not progressing enough in the company, and we have a conscious policy to put women in exposure positions where they will be prepared for further executive positions. So that's why we're looking for a woman. We want to give them a chance. So I saw my implicit bias, and I was assuming a bias in them that they actually didn't have. They were aware of it and were working against the bias to try and provide opportunities. And that really just made me very careful when I assume people are working out of bias. It's frequently true.
Yeah.
Not
And
always.
Thank you, Kathy. And that's why I invite people to turn that judgment into wonder. Just with a simple question. I wonder why it's important to have a woman in this position. Can you tell me more about that?
That was more my tone, but I was really worked up inside, and so was motivated to make the question.
Yeah. Anyone else have an experience to share? And thank you for that workplace experience, Kathy, because we're going to talk about some tips and strategies and think about next.
Mine is also just sort of give a flip side to Joel's, which I do believe that ageism definitely works in a bad direction when it comes to older candidates for all the reasons that Joel said. I found in my last job too, where I did a lot of the hiring, that there was also an implicit bias against younger candidates. So anybody in their 20s or even early 30s, that they were, and it wasn't that they were looking for a certain level of years of experience. That's fine. Was the idea that younger candidates are divisive and don't want to follow the rules, that they don't respect their elders, or that they're like job hoppers and they're just money driven, and that they're not interested in the passions of a nonprofit. So a lot of candidates I met with who I thought were really wonderful, but only maybe 5 or 6 years out of school, they wouldn't even interview because they weren't interested in having that sort of mindset on the team. And that got frustrating as well.
Wow, that's a huge bias. That's huge to not even consider someone, again, just based on the fact, it really based on what you've heard versus what you've actually seen and experienced. But that experience does come into play, because oftentimes the judgments that we make are based upon an experience that we've had. So that's why I asked you to think about, when we're considering implicit bias in the brain, an observation that you've made or an experience that you've had, because that drives the way that we continue to think about certain things. That experience still sits in that 95% of our decision making, that system one thinking is still sitting there, and it bubbles up when you run into someone who reminds you of that situation or looks like that person. Okay.
So I have a quick comment.
Uh-huh.
So as I was sharing that about this feeling I had when I was new here about folks speaking very loudly to me and very slowly to me, I was thinking of the reverse situation. Here I am in an environment, folks around me haven't seen someone like me before. And so how am I to just assume that they know who I am? And that's adding to the point that you made, Inger. There's always two sides to something, isn't it? But our implicit bias is telling us, I am the focus now. I am the center of it all. I want everybody else to be patient, to treat me normally.
And that's how it plays out. Yeah.
That's amazing.
I was thinking about something similar in, I think when I was working, I had so much experience with how to, whether like Joel, how I dressed or what I did to combat what I thought would be a lot of perceived or implicit bias, because I'm very short. I'm only 5 feet tall and a woman, and I was in a very male focused industry. And, so I kind of had that down, or I knew what to expect. And then when I retired, and so I'm not wearing suits or dresses, I'm just casual and I'm just hanging out and what have you. And I found where I would go, people just would not take me very seriously. And I was so shocked, because at work, everybody always took me seriously. And I think when I was in work mode, it spilled out into my whole life. But now I'm relaxed and, usually just out walking around with my dog or what have you. But if people ask me something, or if I'm sharing something, I just felt like people were not taking me seriously. Now, if people got to know me and talk to me more, I think it would go away. But it was a little bit shocking at first, all of a sudden dealing with that again, when I felt like maybe I had done so much work to push it away before. I don't know if other people feel that.
And although you were trying to mitigate it and push it away, it's still there.
Yeah.
Still there. Yeah. So let's talk about what might still be in workspaces. Let's see, a voice that Tom, I'm going to throw this question out to you, Tom, because this is implicit bias in the workplace or the workspace. So when you look at the job descriptions that you may have encountered recently, does the way the job description is written demonstrate an imbalance of gender or cultural patterns? And there's an example there: pronouns, culturally influenced adjectives like high-powered or rock star.
It depends. The one thing, we were talking a little bit about experience levels and things like that. And one thing I ran across early in my career was people said minimum level of experience required. So they would say you'd have to have 5 years of experience to do that. Well, that's back to us not stepping back and saying, what skill set are you really looking for by that level of experience, right? So some job descriptions, frankly, throughout my career, I had trouble when people would ask for job descriptions. I tended not to try to give them a written job description because it could be interpreted inappropriately, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather explain somebody what we were looking for and what the job was going to do, and read what the person's question may be, versus having them, to your point a little bit, if you just read a job description, sometimes the person that wrote the job description may not have always used the most appropriate or the best language to somebody that may be reading that description.
Yeah, because sometimes when you read a job description, you can almost anticipate if the job is written more for someone who identifies as male or for someone who identifies as female. You can almost see, based upon the words that are
Yeah.
chosen and the words that are selected. And then you have to think about culturally. You may hear things like high-powered or rock star. Well, culturally, that might be appropriate in some spaces, but in other spaces, it may not be. One of the first things that we do typically, we had to pause for a minute during the pandemic, was when we're meeting somebody new and job description and it's an interview. And as most organizations, companies worldwide are trying to do now, one of the things they talk a lot about is diversifying their workforce. One of the first things that we typically do is extend our hand for a handshake, right? So I'm going to ask you all this, not just for Tom, anyone. If someone shakes your hand and it's not a firm handshake, does that disqualify or does that make you think about the candidate differently? Do you see that candidate differently if they don't extend your hand, if they don't shake your hand firmly?
No.
No.
I think that used to be the case maybe 20
Mm.
years ago, but not as much anymore.
Okay. Okay.
No, because even some people, they don't like to give hand.
Right.
So-
Exactly. Especially post-COVID, you know, we had to move away from
Yeah.
handshaking some. So yeah.
And,
But-
and
but
in certain
James, this is-
cultures, you just don't do it.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
I recall that huge phase the US went through when they were very close to Japan and there were hordes of people going to Japan. And they had to learn etiquette. The Japanese do not touch, they bow.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. So now
Right.
when you're thinking about this process, you go through a recruitment. When you are looking for folks to bring into your organization, you do your recruitment. So keep in mind, how is the job description written? Is it written in a way that imbalances gender or culture? Next step is, all right, now we're going into the interview phase. Candidate is there. When minimizing that implicit bias, you have to think about, are there certain triggers that you've developed to eliminate people? Are there?
Yeah.
There probably are. It could be the way that they have, the way that they are dressed, the style of their hair. It could be if you're taking them out to dinner. I read that this is a long time ago, of course, but Henry Ford, if a person put salt on their food, added salt to their food before they tasted it, that was like a no-go. That was the end of the interview. That was the end of them being considered. So there are little nuanced things that we bring into the interview situation that can make us disqualify a candidate, someone who could knock it out the park in terms of being able to perform, but there's certain triggers, implicit bias, that we've developed to eliminate people. Any thoughts on that?
Yes,
I just
go
wanted-
ahead, go ahead.
I just wanted to share a story and why I thought the consultant was still with us. We did a executive director search for an organization recently. And it was a challenging search because it's a small organization and they didn't have a lot of money to pay, which meant that we really had to explain to the organization that likely it was going to be, the person was going to be somebody that this was going to be a stepping stone position or a stepping down position.
Mhm.
Yeah. And oh, good. Laura, you're back. I was just talking about a recent executive
Yep.
director search, which was freaking awesome.
Yes.
And I use those words because the first time when we did our initial interview and we're chatting with the candidate who was maybe in her late 20s and being considered for an executive director, she used the word freaking awesome, the term freaking awesome, because she was really genuinely excited about it. And we record these interviews and we presented it to the board members, and they were very put off by that, in terms of, because that's where this person was and also how they presented and whatnot. So once again, a very cultural bias. I also wanted to mention, we do a lot of position searches for other nonprofits. And we are very careful to, when we advertise or post a position for an organization, we don't talk to what I think Tom was saying. We don't post a job description. I mean, for the most part, people know what a senior accountant does, or what a caseworker does, or so we don't spend a lot of time. We spend time talking about the culture of the organization. We're looking for people who resonate with the organization and are going to fit in, and then have the skills and being able to sift through the skills and how they present, to see, are they going to be ultimately a good fit? Do they get it? Do they really understand? And we really work hard to try to inform our clients, the nonprofits, that this is how we go about doing it. We're really looking for people. And so, if we get somebody that has a lot of experience, don't automatically dismiss them because they're overqualified. Maybe they're interested in the job, not because they're because they need a job, but maybe they're looking for meaningful work. And the money is not so important at this point. So,
what Joel did in the situation that he mentioned, where we were looking for that executive director, that's the part that I'm super curious about, which is the client definitely had this bias. We really felt strongly that this candidate was the best, and he was able to have a conversation without offending them that got them to think about things a little differently. And that's, I was so impressed by that at the time, and I still am. And then they sent us all these notes and pictures about how great she's working out, so it made us so happy. But I feel like sometimes you see it and it almost gets your hackles up, but you don't want to show that to the client. So it's really, how do you, in a way that they can take in without getting defensive, how do you do that when you come into these situations? That's the part I'm super curious about.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that, but just to answer it quickly, part of it is education. How are we educating people about that? Because some organizations don't spend time at all considering implicit bias in anything that they do. Everything is just, this is the way that we do things. It's worked for us in the past, and we're going to continue to do that. Versus, let's explore some things like, when they're going through that interview process, does the candidate remind them of anyone? And if so, does that reminder reflect a positive experience or a negative experience? Because that's going to come into play when you're thinking about moving them forward and considering them for hiring. And when you're looking at that, when you're considering for hiring, what are patterns or trends that you've noticed in who accepts an offer and who declines, so that you can better determine if maybe there's some subtle messages about vibes that might be sent that are not positive, or maybe they are positive. But when you think about offering a position and the person declines or the person accepts, what do you then go back and take a look at to determine if there are any implicit or unconscious messages or vibes that are sent during that process? And then this, I think, speaks to Alexa, because you're getting ready. No, I'm sorry, not Alexa. It was, let's see. Was it Madeline who's getting ready to go through the onboarding?
Oh,
no, Amelia.
yeah.
Amelia's getting ready to do the onboarding on Friday. So in thinking about that, what does the cultural orientation look like, sound like, or feel like? And how is someone who's going to be new to the organization, how do they learn those unwritten rules? Because there are unwritten rules in every organization. So how do they learn those? How do they become aware of them so that they don't break them? Because they're new to the organization. There are things that that are embedded in just the, just the culture and an environment. But how do they learn them if they're new? Who's gonna correct them, or who's gonna check them if they break one of those unwritten rules? And then who's gonna say, well, that's an unwritten rule? And then the comeback is, well, how would I know that it's an unwritten rule? So it puts people in a very tense, if you will, or tension-filled position, because they don't want to upset anything and they don't want to miss out on those unwritten rules, but they're unwritten. So how do you know? Unless you begin to really explore, well, do we have some implicit biases that are embedded in our unwritten rules that we're not even sharing with people? All right. So going to your point, Laura, thinking about, well, what do we do? What do we do with all of this information? Part of it is making sure that you become aware of the biases so that those biases can be interrupted. So before you get into a conversation with someone, whether it's a colleague or potential hire or a funder, and you see that the conversation is going in a different direction, and you kind of feel triggered, just kind of take a 10-minute pause and ask yourself, what is my bias towards this person? And how do I disrupt what I know is on autopilot? Because we've already said all of this is hardwired. How do I disrupt those thoughts so that I can genuinely see and listen to them? And then just becoming more aware, we can start to replace those biases with more active or receptive listening and affirming thoughts. All right. So that's one tip. Another strategy is really doing the hard work. It's studying and teaching colleagues about implicit bias. So a couple of quick facts. Bias is something that is universal to the human condition. And when we look at it in schools, white teachers are 30% less likely than Black teachers to predict their 10th grade Black students would someday earn a college degree. I use this one because it has personal meaning for me. I have a 10th grader. My goal, our goal, my husband's goal, my family's goal is, of course, for both my boys to go to college. But if they're in situations where 85% of the workforce includes white female teachers, then the likelihood that they are not going to be encouraged to go to college because the expectation or the prediction is that they won't. What do we do about that? What do we do about those things? Because we all carry these biases, and we all have to think about what we do with those biases. What do we do with them? So listening helps us to take in those multiple perspectives, multiple stories, and it disrupts that bias thinking that always follows us. So study it and teach colleagues about it. If we're not talking to each other and saying, you know what, I'm thinking that there is some implicit bias going on here, and I just want to check you on it. I want to say, and I want to check in. Am I right? So again, turning that judgment into a wonder, and then pay attention to what other organizations around you are doing, because there are some organizations that have already addressed this. They know how to navigate these spaces. We all know people who are part of organizations who can connect with and they can support the success of the folks that are working with them. So consider how those folks are managing their own biases. What do they do? Learn from each other. How do they get to know individuals? How do they get to know the complexities, really, of individuals that are working there? And how do they build trust? Trust is essential in order to shift and make these changes that we're talking about. And then we have a tendency to tone police. We think more about the way something was said versus what was said. And so when people who are oftentimes marginalized, when they speak up about their struggles, sometimes people from more dominant groups, they focus more on what they said. I'm sorry, they focus not on what was said, but how people said it. You know, if their voice or intonation changed, they're focusing on that versus the trauma or the impact that was associated with the event. So to challenge that, we have to listen to colleagues who've been underestimated or maybe misjudged. And particularly when people of color are in spaces where they are maybe not necessarily the majority in terms of number, when they're brave enough to speak up and name bias, they are sometimes seen as you're too emotional or you're making it up. So there's nothing made up about implicit bias. We know that. You've seen it, you've experienced it. So we have to learn from those who are courageous enough to speak up. And then finally, we have to tune into our own bias at work. Really be intentional. So ask yourself these questions. Where do I see implicit bias playing out in our organization? What fear or apprehension maybe do I have about addressing it? And how can I be an ally to colleagues who have experienced bias in our organization or in other organizations? Those three simple questions can change the way you're tuning into bias in your workplace. So last thought, biases are the stories we make up about people before we know who they really are. So thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for creating the brave space so that we could do this. Thank you for sharing your lunchtime with me.
Well, thank you, Inger. This was incredible. And I so appreciate your joining us today and presenting this. I think this is so relevant to the work that we do. And I know some of it ended in talking about the workplace, but I really see this beyond the workplace. And the concepts are just in life and going to the grocery store or whatever it is that we do, and how we carry this wiring, pre-wiring that we have with us in terms of interacting. So thank you so much. I'm so glad you were able to join us today.
You're welcome. Thank you all. It was a pleasure. I love the conversation. I love the fact that you all aren't apprehensive about having these kinds of conversations. So I see in the chat that there was a question about repeating those three questions or request to repeat those. So where do I see implicit biases playing out in our organization? What kinds of fears or apprehensions do you have about addressing the issue? And how can you be an ally to colleagues who experience bias in the organization?
Inger, I wanted to ask you, because we're recording today, if it's okay if I share today's recording with our consultants?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sure. And, if you are interested in us having another conversation, it's good. It's good sometimes to be able to bring everyone together to talk about these things that we oftentimes don't talk about.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm very lucky because you and I get to talk about some of these things on a regular basis, which I very much appreciate. So really,
Same here.
To share you with our community.
Same here. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your time and have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, you too. We'll send some sunshine your way.
Please. I'm going to need it.
Thank you.
All righty. Take care, everyone. Nice meeting you all.